5 Amish girls stared at a mountain man's cabin every single day, but then suddenly one morning they didn't appear. The old cabin sat silent on the ridge, smoke rising from its chimney, while the girls were nowhere to be found. Whispers spread through town like wildfire. Had the recluse taken them? Or had something darker stolen them away in the night? A deputy rattles his jail keys. A church bell tolls heavy in the cold air. Hooves thunder down the muddy street as men accuse the mountain man of a crime he swears he didn't commit. But hidden behind the girl's vanishing is a secret worth more than land itself. A secret powerful men will do anything to keep buried. Now, with his name blackened and 5 innocent lives at stake, the outcast must decide, will he stand alone against the town and the railroad's greed, or let the girls vanish forever into silence? What truly happened the day 5 Amish girls stopped staring at the mountain man's cabin? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The crisp mountain air carried the rhythmic thunk of Jonas's axe as he split logs beside his weathered cabin. Sweat dampened his shirt despite the cool autumn morning, and his muscles burned with the satisfying ache of honest work. The old dog dozed in a patch of sunlight, nose twitching at the scent of pine and wood smoke. Movement caught Jonas's eye. He paused mid-swing, squinting at the ridge that rose above his homestead like the spine of some ancient beast. There, silhouetted against the pale Colorado sky, stood 5 figures in plain dark dresses, their white caps bright as fresh snow against the golden prairie grass. Amish girls. The youngest couldn't have been more than 7 or 8, the eldest perhaps 16. They stood perfectly still, watching him with an intensity that made the hair rise on the back of his neck. The girls huddled close, whispering among themselves, their words lost to the wind and distance. Jonas drove his axe into a stump and wiped his brow with a kerchief. "Got business with me?" he called out, his voice rough from disuse. The girls startled like deer, then turned and walked away, disappearing over the ridge toward their settlement. He'd heard tell of an Amish community setting up a few miles north, but he'd kept his distance. Jonas preferred the quiet company of his dog and the familiar solitude of his mountain home. Still, something about their silent observation needled at him. The next day dawned clear and cold. Jonas was mending a hole in his coat when he felt eyes upon him once more. Sure enough, the 5 girls had returned to their perch on the ridge. They stood like sentinels, their dresses rippling in the wind. This time, one of the younger ones pointed at him before being hushed by her sisters. "Ain't much to see here," Jonas muttered, turning his back to them. But their presence weighed on him like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. When he looked again, they had vanished. The 3rd day brought them back as reliable as sunrise. Jonas was checking his trap lines when he spotted them, lined up like fence posts against the sky. His dog growled low, hackles rising. "Easy, boy," Jonas said, though unease churned in his gut. Were they mocking him? Spying? In his 15 years on this mountain, he'd grown accustomed to being left alone. Now these silent watchers had invaded his peace, stirring up memories he'd rather keep buried. That evening, Jonas sat at his rough-hewn table, spooning up a meager supper of beans and cornbread. The cabin felt emptier than usual, the shadows deeper. His thoughts drifted to Sarah, as they often did in quiet moments. She would have known what to make of those girls. She'd always had a way of understanding people that he lacked. The ache of her absence hit him fresh like a wound that never properly healed. 8 years since the fever took her, yet sometimes he still woke reaching for her warm presence beside him. The lonely years stretched out in his mind like the long shadow of a mountain at sunset. His dog's growl pulled him from his brooding. The animal stood at the window, staring at the darkening ridge where the girls had stood. Jonas rose and peered out, but saw only the gathering dusk and the first stars pricking through the purple sky. He couldn't go on like this, jumping at shadows and wondering about their purpose. Better to face whatever was coming than hide in his cabin like a spooked rabbit. Jonas had survived blizzards, bears, and the crushing weight of grief. He wouldn't be undone by the curiosity of 5 Amish girls. Moving with purpose, Jonas retrieved his hunting knife from its sheath. The blade was dull from skinning rabbits. He took out his whetstone and began to sharpen it with slow, deliberate strokes, the familiar rhythm steady at his thoughts. When the knife was razor-sharp, he turned his attention to his rifle. It was an old Sharps, worn smooth from years of use but still true as the day he'd bought it. Jonas cleaned it thoroughly, more from habit than any expectation of needing it. Whatever game these girls were playing, he doubted it warranted bullets. Still, frontier folk didn't waste time watching strangers without reason. He'd learned that lesson the hard way, back when he first staked his claim on this lonely stretch of mountain. Better to be ready for whatever tomorrow might bring. As Jonas worked, his dog settled by the hearth with a heavy sigh. The cabin creaked and settled around them, a sound as familiar as his own breathing. Outside, a coyote called to its mate, its lonely song echoing off the ridges. He thought again of the girls, trying to make sense of their silent vigil. Their faces had seemed solemn, not mocking. Something about their steady gaze reminded him of Sarah's eyes when she knew a truth he hadn't yet admitted to himself. Jonas set the rifle aside and pulled out Sarah's Bible from the trunk where he kept her things. The leather was cracked and faded, the pages worn soft from her touch. He hadn't opened it since her passing, but tonight, his fingers traced the familiar cover. The last candle guttered in its holder as Jonas sat in his chair, the Bible in his lap, listening to the night sounds and his dog's quiet breathing. Tomorrow, he decided, he would solve this mystery. Whether the girls returned or not, he couldn't go on wondering about their purpose. He'd face whatever came with clear eyes and steady hands. That's what Sarah would have wanted. That's what the mountain had taught him, that sometimes the only way forward was through. As Jonas banked the fire for the night, the wind picked up, rattling the cabin's shutters. His dog raised its head, ears pricked toward the ridge. But no more visitors appeared in the darkness, only the shadows of clouds crossing the face of the rising moon. Morning would come soon enough, bringing with it whatever answers the Amish girls held. Jonas climbed into his cold bed, Sarah's Bible still on the table beside him. As sleep took him, he thought he heard the echo of young voices carried on the wind. But it might have been only the whisper of pine boughs in the night. The mystery of their watching weighed on his mind, but Jonas had learned patience from the mountains. Tomorrow would reveal what it would, and he would meet it as he had met every challenge since Sarah's passing, with determination and the quiet strength that came from surviving loss. His last thought before sleep claimed him was of those white caps bobbing like clouds against the golden grass, and the strange feeling that something long dormant was stirring in the hollow places of his heart. Dawn painted the Colorado sky in streaks of pearl and gold, as Jonas shouldered his canteen and began the climb. The morning air bit sharp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and sage. His boots crunched through frost-stiffened grass as he made his way up the familiar slope. He'd watched the girls take this path often enough to know exactly where they'd be. Sure enough, as he crested the ridge, there they stood like a cluster of dark butterflies against the brightening sky. Their plain dresses and white caps caught the early light, making them seem almost to glow. The youngest one spotted him first. Her eyes went wide as saucers, and she tugged urgently at her eldest sister's sleeve. The others shifted nervously, but didn't scatter, as Jonas had half expected them to do. Instead, they drew closer together, the little ones sheltering behind their older sisters. Jonas stopped a respectful distance away, his hands loose at his sides to show he meant no harm. "Reckon it's time we had us a talk," he said, keeping his voice gentle despite its roughness. The eldest girl, she must have been 16 or so, stepped forward. Her face was composed, though her hands twisted in her apron. "I am Rachel," she said, her voice clear and steady. "These are my sisters." Jonas nodded, studying their faces. Up close, the family resemblance was clear. Same dark eyes, same determined set to their chins. "Your folk know you're up here?" he asked. "Yeah," Rachel answered. "It was Ma'am who sent us." She paused, gathering her courage. "She asked us to watch your chimney smoke each day, to make sure you still live." Jonas frowned, confusion and suspicion warring in his mind. "Your ma'am?" "Don't recall meeting any Amish folk hereabouts." "She says we owe you a debt," Rachel continued. Her younger sisters nodded solemnly behind her. though she didn't tell us exactly why, only that we must watch and pray and report that you're still well. The morning wind rustled through the grass, carrying a hint of winter's approach. Jonas shifted his weight, trying to make sense of this strange tale. That's a mighty peculiar task for your mom to set you. Rachel's chin lifted slightly. We trust our mother's wisdom. She is a woman of great faith. Jonas studied the girls' earnest faces. There was no hint of mockery or deceit in their expressions, only a sort of quiet determination that reminded him of someone, though he couldn't quite place who. Well, he said finally, seeing as you've been keeping such close watch on me, least I can do is offer you some water before you head home. Creeks running clear and cold this time of year. The younger girls looked to Rachel, who considered for a moment before nodding. Danke, that would be kind. Jonas led them down the other side of the ridge toward his cabin. The girls followed in a neat line, their boots whispering through the grass. The youngest one hummed softly, what sounded like a hymn tune, until one of her sisters shushed her. At the creek, Jonas filled his canteen and offered it first to Rachel. She took a careful sip before passing it to her sisters. The youngest one giggled when the cold water dripped on her chin, and for a moment the solemn spell was broken. They were just children after all, Jonas thought, despite their grave purpose. Your mom, he said as they prepared to leave. What's her name? Anna, Rachel answered. Anna Yoder. The name meant nothing to him, but something about it tugged at his memory like a half-forgotten dream. He watched them file back up the ridge, their shapes dark against the morning sky. Just before they disappeared over the top, the youngest one turned and waved. Jonas found himself lifting his hand in response before he quite meant to. That evening, as shadows lengthened across his cabin floor, Jonas sat in his chair by the fire and tried to remember. The name Anna Yoder meant nothing, but there was something about the girl's quiet faith that stirred old memories. Years ago, how many, 7, 8? There had been a winter storm fierce enough to bury the valley in snow. He'd found a wagon stuck in a drift, the horses struggling and a family huddled inside, nearly frozen. He'd led them to shelter in a cave he knew, shared his food and blankets, kept them alive until the storm passed. He hadn't thought about that night in years, hadn't wanted to remember how the mother's prayers had reminded him of Sarah, or how the children's trust had made his heart ache with memories of the family he'd hoped to have. When the storm cleared, he'd pointed them toward the nearest settlement and returned to his solitude. Could that woman have been Anna Yoder? Jonas couldn't be certain. The storm had blown so thick and white he'd barely seen their faces. But something about the way Rachel had spoken of her mother's faith. His dog whined softly and laid its head on his knee. Jonas scratched behind its ears, remembering how the youngest child in that wagon had clung to a similar dog for warmth. Reckon we might have some visitors to get used to, he told the animal. The fire popped and sparked, sending shadows dancing across the walls. Jonas thought of the girls standing sentinel on his ridge, watching his chimney smoke with such solemn purpose. Their trust unsettled something deep in his chest, something he'd thought long buried under years of solitude. He rose and walked to the window. The moon was rising, casting silver light across the ridge where the girls had stood. Their mother's faith had bound them to him somehow, watching over his life as he had once watched over theirs. If, indeed, they were the same family. The thought should have annoyed him, this invasion of his carefully maintained solitude. Instead, he felt something else, something he wasn't quite ready to name. His dog pressed against his leg, and together they stood at the window, watching the moon climb higher over the silent ridge. Somewhere out there, 5 girls were telling their mother that Jonas Kipp still lived, still sent smoke rising from his chimney into the Colorado sky. The thought followed him to bed, where he lay awake for a long time, remembering the sound of prayers in a snowstorm, and the way trust could warm a heart as surely as any fire. For 3 days, a delicate rhythm settled over Jonas Kipp's mountain home. Each morning, as sure as the sun rising over the eastern peaks, the 5 Amish girls would appear on the ridge. Jonas found himself watching for their arrival, while going about his morning chores. He'd lift his hand in greeting, and they'd wave back, the youngest one always more enthusiastically than her sisters. On the 4th morning, Jonas stepped out into the crisp autumn air, his breath forming clouds in front of him. He grabbed his axe, ready to split more wood for the coming winter. As he worked, his eyes kept drifting to the ridge. The sun climbed higher, painting the golden grass with morning light. But the familiar sight of white caps and dark dresses never appeared. By mid-morning, an unfamiliar worry had settled in Jonas's gut. He set down his axe and wiped the sweat from his brow, staring at the empty ridge. His dog whined beside him, sensing his unease. "Might be they're just late," Jonas muttered, more to convince himself than the dog. But the girls had never been late before. Their dedication to their mother's request had been as regular as clockwork. When noon came and went with no sign of them, Jonas could no longer ignore his growing concern. He pulled on his coat, checked his knife was secure in its sheath, and started down the trail toward the settlement. His dog trotted beside him, alert and watchful. The walk took longer than he expected. He'd grown unused to making the journey to town. As he approached the settlement's edge, he noticed something was wrong. Groups of people stood in clusters, talking in low, urgent voices. When they spotted him, conversations stopped abruptly, and hard stares followed his progress. Near the general store, a cluster of men huddled in serious discussion. Jonas recognized a few faces from his rare trips to trade fairs. As he drew closer, fragments of their conversation reached him. Gone without a trace, all 5 of them. Doors weren't even forced. Jonas's steps slowed. A heavy-set man with a gray beard noticed him first and fell silent, nudging his companions. The group turned to face Jonas, their expressions a mixture of suspicion and barely contained anger. "Kip," one of them said, his voice cold. "Mighty interesting timing you showing up today." Jonas stopped, keeping a careful distance. "Heard there might be trouble. The Amish girls didn't come by this morning." A ripple of mutters passed through the group. The bearded man spat in the dirt. "Didn't come by," he says. "More like they vanished in the night. Every last one of them girls gone from their beds." The news hit Jonas like a physical blow. "Vanished," he repeated, his voice rough. "How?" "Some say Indians," another man offered, though his tone suggested he didn't believe it. "Sneaked in during the night, quiet-like." "Indians?" Jonas scoffed. "The nearest tribe's been peaceful for years." "Trade with them myself sometimes." "Well then, maybe someone else had reason to take them," the first man said, his eyes boring into Jonas. "Someone who's been watching them. Someone who lives alone up in them hills." Jonas felt his jaw tighten. "If you've got something to say it plain." "Folk have seen them girls up by your cabin," the bearded man said. "Every morning, regular as sunrise. Mighty peculiar interest you've taken in them." "I never laid a hand on those girls," Jonas growled, his fingers itching to form fists. But he kept them loose at his sides, knowing any show of anger would only feed their suspicions. "That's not what Deputy Rollins thinks," someone in the back of the group called out. "He's riding out to your cabin right now to have a look for himself." Jonas turned without another word and started back up the trail, his long strides eating up the distance. His dog kept pace, hackles raised at its master's tension. Jonas's mind raced as he walked. The girls had been fine yesterday morning, standing on his ridge like always. What could have happened between then and now? He reached his cabin just as Deputy Rollins was dismounting his horse. The lawman's hand rested casually near his holstered revolver, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed. "Deputy," Jonas said, keeping his voice neutral. Rollins was in his mid-30s, with the clean-shaven look of a man who took his position seriously. "Kip," he said, adjusting his badge, "I need to have a look around your property." "You got a warrant?" "Don't need one when 5 girls are missing and you're the last person known to have contact with them." Rollins's hand moved closer to his gun. "You going to make this difficult?" Jonas considered his options. Fighting would only make him look guilty. He stepped aside and gestured to his cabin. "Look all you want. Won't find nothing but traps and furs." The deputy spent the next hour searching every corner of Jonas's home. He went through Jonas's stores of dried meat and beans, checked under the floorboards, even climbed up to the small loft where Jonas kept his furs. Outside, he examined the woodpile, the creek bank, and the surrounding brush. Finally, Rollins stood in the cabin's doorway, frustration evident on his face. Just as Jonas had said, he'd found nothing but the simple tools of a mountain man's trade: Traps, furs, hunting gear, and basic provisions. "Seems you're living clean enough," Rollins said, though his tone suggested this didn't clear Jonas of suspicion. "But I should warn you, town's already made up its mind about you. Folks don't take kindly to someone who keeps to himself the way you do. Makes them wonder what you're hiding." "I ain't hiding anything," Jonas said. "Those girls came here of their own accord. Their mother sent them." "So you say." Rollins adjusted his hat. "But 5 girls don't just disappear without someone being responsible. And right now, you're the only stranger who's had any contact with them." "I want them found safe as much as anyone," Jonas insisted. "For your sake, better hope they are." Rollins mounted his horse. "I'll be watching you, Kip. Don't try leaving the area." Jonas watched the deputy ride away, his dog pressing against his leg in silent support. The afternoon light was fading, casting long shadows across his yard. He went inside and built up the fire, but its warmth couldn't chase away the chill that had settled in his bones. Sitting in his chair, Jonas stared into the flames. The girls' faces floated in his memory. Rachel's quiet strength, the youngest one's bright smile. Someone had taken them, that much was clear. But who? And why now? Just when they'd started watching over him. His dog growled softly, and Jonas reached down to scratch its ears. "Something ain't right about this," he murmured. "Somebody's got reason to want those girls gone. Question is, who benefits from making them disappear?" The fire crackled and popped, offering no answers. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the first real bite of winter. On the ridge where the girls had stood each morning, dead leaves danced like restless spirits in the gathering dark. Jonas knew he should feel angry at being suspected, at having his home searched. Instead, all he felt was a deep, gnawing worry for 5 innocent girls who'd trusted him with their morning vigil. Somewhere out there, they needed help. And despite what the town thought of him, Jonas couldn't shake the feeling that he was somehow meant to find them. The question was where to start looking, and how could he search for them when every move he made would be watched with suspicion? Jonas added another log to the fire and settled in for a long night of thinking. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now he needed to piece together everything he knew about the girl's disappearance. Something about it nagged at him, like a splinter under the skin, small but persistent, demanding attention. Dawn broke cold and gray over the mountains. Jonas saddled his horse before first light, determination setting his jaw in a hard line. The accusations from yesterday still burned in his gut. If the town wanted answers, he'd demand some of his own. The main street was already crowded when he arrived. More people than usual gathered in clusters outside the general store. Their urgent whispers died as he rode past, replaced by suspicious stares. Jonas dismounted near the hitching post, his boots raising small clouds of dust. A man's voice rose above the murmur of the crowd. "The law's clear as day. That land's been designated for the railroad's use." Jonas turned toward the sound. A well-dressed man in his 40s stood on the store's wooden porch, his suit marking him as an outsider. A polished watch chain glinted at his vest. This had to be Caldwell, the railroad agent who had been pressing local farmers to sell. "These simple folk need to understand progress," Caldwell continued, playing to his audience. "We can't let religious peculiarities stand in the way of civilization's advance. That Amish family had their chance to sell fair and square." Something moved in the crowd, a flash of white cap and plain dress. Jonas's heart jumped as Rachel burst through the gathering, her face pale but determined. Her younger sisters were nowhere in sight. When she spotted Jonas, relief flooded her features. "Jonas," she cried, running toward him, "help us, please." Deputy Rollins stepped forward, one hand on his gun belt. "Hold it right there, Kip. The girl's coming with me." But Rachel reached Jonas first, gripping his arm with trembling fingers. "Don't let them take me back," she pleaded. "They'll lock me away like my sisters." The crowd pressed closer, hungry for drama. Caldwell's smooth facade cracked slightly. "Now, young lady, you're confused. Your father agreed to place you and your sisters in proper care while he considers our offer." "That's a lie." Rachel's voice shook with anger. "Father never agreed to anything. Your men came in the night, said they'd hurt us if he didn't sign. When he still refused, they took my sisters away." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Jonas felt Rachel's grip tighten as Deputy Rollins approached, flanked by 2 other men. "Step away from the girl, Kip," Rollins ordered. "You're under arrest for interference with a legal matter." Jonas kept his voice steady. "Seems to me the only legal matter here is kidnapping." He looked down at Rachel. "You sure about what happened?" She nodded, tears in her eyes. "They wore masks, but I heard Mr. Caldwell's voice. He told Father the railroad would have our land one way or another. I got away through the root cellar while they were taking Sarah and the others." Caldwell's pleasant mask slipped further. "Deputy, this girl is clearly distraught. Her kind aren't used to modern ways. Best take her into protective custody before she tells more truth," Jonas cut in. The crowd's mood was shifting, uncertain whispers replacing hostile stares. Rollins took another step forward. "Don't make this worse, Kip. You're already in enough trouble." Jonas sized up the situation. 3 armed men against him, with Caldwell's smooth lies poisoning the air. But Rachel's trembling hand on his arm told him all he needed to know about right and wrong. "Reckon I'll take my chances," he said softly. Then, in one fluid motion, he swept Rachel onto his horse and swung up behind her. The animal, sensing urgency, wheeled away from the hitching post. "Stop them," Caldwell shouted. Rollins drew his revolver, but the crowd's movement and the horse's speed made a clean shot impossible. Jonas guided them through the press of people, who scattered rather than risk being trampled. By the time they cleared the town's edge, only distant shouts followed them up the mountain trail. Jonas didn't slow until they reached the relative safety of his cabin. Rachel hadn't spoken during their escape, but her rigid posture gradually relaxed as familiar territory surrounded them. He helped her down, noting how she trembled despite her brave face. "You're safe here," he assured her, leading the horse to the stable. "We'll figure this out." Inside the cabin, Jonas built up the fire while Rachel perched on his wooden chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. His dog lay at her feet, sensing her need for comfort. "Tell me everything," Jonas said, keeping his voice gentle. "Start from the beginning." Rachel took a deep breath. "Mr. Caldwell came to our farm 2 weeks ago, talking about progress and opportunity. Said the railroad needed our land for a new spur line. Father told him we're simple people. We don't sell what God gave us to tend." She twisted her apron between her fingers. "That's when the threats started. Little things at first. Fences cut, animals spooked. Then, 3 nights ago, they came with lanterns and guns." Jonas listened, anger building as Rachel described masked men forcing their way into the family's home, threatening violence if her father didn't sign the deed. When he still refused, they took the younger girls. For safekeeping, they claimed. "I hid in the root cellar," Rachel continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "There was a loose board in back. I squeezed through while they were loading my sisters into a wagon. I ran all night, staying in the woods, watching the town. When I saw you ride in this morning," she met his eyes, "I knew God had sent you to help." Jonas turned to stare into the fire, wrestling with the weight of her faith in him. "Your mother," he said slowly. "She was in that wagon train I helped years back, wasn't she?" "During the blizzard?" Rachel nodded. "She never forgot your kindness, said God puts people in our path when we need them most. That's why she sent us to watch over you, to repay the debt by making sure you weren't alone anymore." The irony of it twisted in Jonas's chest. He'd thought the girls were spying when really they'd been expressing gratitude through the only means their mother's conscience would allow. Outside, the light was fading. The first few snowflakes drifted past the window, promising a long night ahead. Jonas added more wood to the fire, his mind working through what they knew. "Caldwell's got money and the law on his side," he said grimly. "But men like him always leave tracks if you know where to look." "What can we do?" Rachel asked. "First, we keep you safe. Tomorrow, I'll start asking questions in places Caldwell won't expect." Jonas checked his rifle and arranged blankets near the fire. "You take the bed. I'll keep watch." Rachel settled onto the thin mattress, her white cap stark against the worn quilt. As darkness gathered outside, her soft voice lifted in a hymn. Words Jonas didn't understand, but the melody spoke of trust and peace that transcended language. The snow fell thicker now, blanketing the world in silence. Jonas sat in his chair, rifle across his knees, letting Rachel's song wash over him. Her faith steadied him, like a compass pointing true north. Whatever Caldwell had planned, whatever the town thought of him, Jonas knew his path forward was clear. Those girls needed help, and he was done hiding from what needed doing. The hymn faded to silence, replaced by Rachel's steady breathing as she drifted to sleep. Jonas watched the fires dance, remembering another night years ago when he'd guided a lost wagon train through a blizzard. He hadn't known then that his simple act of kindness would echo forward to this moment, binding him to this family's fate. Outside, the wind whispered through pine boughs heavy with snow. Somewhere in the darkness, 4 innocent girls waited for rescue. Jonas settled deeper into his chair, mind already mapping out tomorrow's work. The railroad might have money and power on its side, but he had something stronger, the truth, and a debt of kindness to repay. His dog raised its head, ears twitching at some distant sound. Jonas reached down to scratch its ears, feeling the warmth of Rachel's trust and the weight of responsibility settling around his shoulders like a familiar coat. The night stretched ahead, long and cold, but he would keep watch until dawn broke over the mountains, bringing with it whatever tomorrow might hold. Dawn crept over the mountains with fingers of pale gold, touching the frost-covered grass around Jonas's cabin. Inside, Rachel was already awake, her plain dress smoothed and her white cap neatly tied. She knelt by the rough wooden table, morning prayers whispered in German while Jonas checked his supplies. "I'm coming with you," Rachel said firmly, rising from her prayers. Her eyes held the same steady determination he'd seen yesterday in town. Jonas paused in his packing. "It'll be dangerous. These men ain't got no respect for life or law." "They're my sisters," Rachel replied simply. "I won't hide while they suffer." Something in her quiet resolve reminded Jonas of his late wife Sarah, who'd never backed down from what needed doing. He nodded slowly. "We'll need supplies. Food, blankets for when we find them." Rachel moved through the cabin with purpose, gathering what they'd need. Her hands were quick and sure as she wrapped cornbread and dried meat in clean cloth. Jonas watched her efficiency with growing respect. This wasn't some helpless girl, but a woman raised to face hardship with grace. Outside, the morning air bit sharp and clean. Jonas's horse stamped impatiently while he secured their supplies. He'd added extra ammunition for his rifle, though he prayed they wouldn't need it. Rachel approached with her own bundle, a quilt and some spare clothing for her sisters. "Your father," Jonas said carefully, helping her mount behind him. "He know you're safe?" Rachel's voice was tight with pain. "He was. They gave him whiskey, made him drink it. He couldn't even stand when I left." Her fingers clutched Jonas's coat. "He wouldn't have let them take the girls if he'd been himself." Jonas grunted softly, understanding more than he let on. Shame could drive a man to drink, and drink could make him forget his strength. He clicked to his horse, and they set out, following the wagon ruts that led west from town. The morning wore on as they rode, the sun climbing higher but offering little warmth. Rachel sat straight behind Jonas, her eyes constantly scanning the landscape. They passed scattered homesteads and tired-looking farms, but saw no sign of Caldwell's men or the missing girls. Near midday, they spotted a familiar figure on the trail ahead. Old Pete, a trader who regularly passed through these parts with his mule train. The old man raised a hand in greeting as they approached. "Mighty careful day to be riding out, Jonas," Pete called, his rheumy eyes taking in Rachel's plain dress and cap. "Town's all stirred up about them missing Amish girls." Jonas kept his voice neutral. "Heard anything about that?" Pete spat to the side, his face darkening. "Matter of fact, I did. Passed some rough types camped down by Dead Man's Creek last night. Making plenty of noise, they were. Drinking hard and laughing about some Amish goods they was guarding." The old trader's expression showed what he thought of that. Recognized one of them as Caldwell's hired muscle. Jonas felt Rachel stiffen behind him. His own anger rose hot and fierce, but her small hand pressed against his back, reminding him of dignity and restraint. "The Lord's justice will find them," Rachel murmured, though Jonas felt her trembling. Pete nodded sagely. "Reckon that's true enough, miss, but sometimes the Lord works through mortal hands." He adjusted his hat, squinting at the western horizon. They was camped where the creek runs dry, near them 3 big cottonwoods. Can't miss it. Jonas touched his hat brim in thanks. As they rode on, Pete called after them. "Watch yourself, Jonas. Them fellows, they ain't playing at being mean. They're the genuine article." The sun was low when Jonas guided them off the main trail, seeking a sheltered spot to make camp. He found it beneath a stand of thick pines where the ground was carpeted with soft needles and the branches would help hide any firelight. "We'll rest here," he said, helping Rachel dismount. "Those men Pete mentioned, they'll be sleeping off their drink come morning. That's when we'll move." Rachel nodded, though anxiety showed in the tight lines around her mouth. While Jonas gathered wood for a small fire, she spread their blankets and set out a simple supper of cornbread and dried apple slices. The familiar tasks seemed to steady her. The fire cast dancing shadows as they ate in companionable silence. Jonas couldn't help noticing how the flickering light softened Rachel's features, making her look younger than her years. Yet there was nothing childlike in her quiet strength or the way she bore her worry for her sisters. "Tell me about them," Jonas said suddenly, surprising himself. "Your sisters?" Rachel's face brightened slightly. "Sarah's the next oldest after me. She loves to sing, knows every hymn by heart. Then there's Mary, who can weave the finest cloth you've ever seen. Rebecca makes friends with every animal she meets, and little Anna." Her voice caught. "Anna's only 7. She still sleeps with her rag doll." Jonas stared into the fire, thinking of 5 little girls watching his chimney smoke, carrying out their mother's wishes with such faithful dedication. The memory of his own wife's faith stirred in his heart. How she'd read her Bible by lamplight, how she'd faced her final illness with quiet courage. "My Sarah was like that," he found himself saying, and strong in her beliefs. Never wavered, even at the end. Rachel's eyes met his across the fire, full of understanding. "Your wife?" Jonas nodded, surprised by how the old pain had softened enough to let him speak of her. "Been gone 6 years now. Sometimes I reckon I lost my own faith when she died. Easier to live alone in the hills than face an empty house." "But you helped our wagon train," Rachel said softly. "Even after your loss, you still showed kindness to strangers." "Didn't know it was your family." "God knew," Rachel replied simply. She began to hum then, a low, sweet hymn that seemed to rise naturally as wood smoke toward the stars. Jonas recognized the tune from his own childhood. Amazing grace needed no translation to touch the heart. The night grew colder, their small fire barely holding back the chill. Jonas added another log, watching Rachel wrap herself tighter in her blanket. Her prayers, whispered in German, floated on the night air like the last leaves of autumn. Jonas settled back against his saddle, rifle close at hand. The familiar weight of the weapon reminded him of the task ahead. But somehow Rachel's presence made it feel less like vengeance and more like justice. Her faith in God's plan wasn't his kind of believing, but he respected its power to guide and sustain. The long trail stretched ahead of them, leading to whatever fate awaited at Dead Man's Creek. Jonas knew the dangers. Caldwell's men were killers playing at being lawmen, and tomorrow would test every skill he'd learned in his years of mountain life. Yet as he watched Rachel finally drift into uneasy sleep, her white cap bright in the dying firelight, he felt an unfamiliar peace settle over him. His dog curled close, alert to night sounds in the darkness beyond their camp. Jonas reached down to scratch its ears, remembering another cold night and a lost wagon train. He hadn't known then that saving those lives would lead him here, to this moment of quiet purpose beside a young woman whose faith outweighed her fear. The stars wheeled overhead, bright and distant as Rachel's gentle breathing mingled with the whisper of wind through pine boughs. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring. But tonight, Jonas kept watch, steady in his resolve. Whatever came with the dawn, he would see this through. He owed it to Rachel's trust, to her sister's innocence, and perhaps to his own Sarah's memory. A debt of faith finally coming due. The second day of their journey dawned cold and gray. Jonas studied the heavy clouds massing on the horizon as he saddled his horse. The weather was turning, and the promise of snow hung in the air like a warning. "Storm's coming," he said quietly to Rachel, who was rolling their blankets with practiced efficiency. "Might work in our favor, cover our tracks, mask any noise we make." Rachel nodded, her face drawn with worry but determined. How far to Deadman's Creek? Few hours' ride if Pete's information holds true. Jonas secured their supplies, then helped Rachel mount. We'll need to be careful approaching. They'll have someone keeping watch, even if they're feeling safe. They rode in tense silence through the morning, Jonas constantly scanning the landscape for signs of pursuit or danger. The wind picked up as they traveled, carrying the sharp scent of coming snow. Rachel huddled closer behind him, seeking warmth against the growing chill. Near midday, Jonas spotted the 3 cottonwoods Pete had mentioned. He guided his horse off the main trail, leading them through a stand of scrub pine that offered cover. When they were about half a mile from where the creek should be, he drew rein. "Wait here," he told Rachel, helping her dismount in a sheltered hollow. "I need to scout their camp first. No sense rushing in blind?" Rachel caught his sleeve, her eyes intense. "Be careful, Jonas. These men, they have no fear of God in them." "Don't need God to handle their kind," Jonas replied grimly. "Just need to know their weaknesses." He squeezed her hand briefly, then set off through the brush, moving as silently as years of hunting had taught him. The ridge overlooking the creek bed provided a perfect vantage point. Jonas lay flat behind a fallen log, studying the scene below through narrowed eyes. 3 men lounged around a smoky campfire, passing a bottle between them. Their wagon stood nearby, its canvas cover firmly lashed. What caught Jonas's attention were the suspicious bundles of blankets piled at the back, too neat to be casual bedding, too still to be simple cargo. His jaw tightened as he counted weapons, 2 rifles leaning against the wagon wheel, pistols on all 3 men. The odds weren't good, but he'd faced worse. What worried him more was the casual cruelty in their postures, the way they laughed and passed that bottle while keeping children captive. As the afternoon wore on, snow began falling in light flurries. Jonas remained motionless, gathering intelligence. He noted how often they checked their surroundings, which man seemed most alert, where they placed their weapons when they moved. Every detail could mean life or death when the moment came. As dusk approached and the snow fell harder, the men's voices grew louder, loosened by whiskey. Jonas inched closer, straining to hear their conversation over the wind. "Waste of time sitting here," one man growled, kicking at the fire. "Should have headed south already." "Orders was to wait," another replied, this one wearing a battered cavalry coat. "Boss wants to make sure no one's following before we move the brats." The third man spat into the fire. "Could get good money for them down Mexico way. Plenty of mines need small hands for working." Jonas felt sick rage build in his gut at their casual discussion of selling children into slavery. He watched until full dark, then carefully made his way back to where Rachel waited. He found her huddled against their horse, praying softly in German. She looked up as he approached, hope and fear warring in her expression. "They're there," Jonas said quietly, settling beside her. "Your sisters are in the wagon, bound up in blankets. 3 men guarding them, all armed." He described what he'd seen and heard, watching Rachel's face grow paler in the gathering darkness. "Dear God," she whispered, crossing herself. "We must get them out tonight. Who knows when they might leave?" Jonas nodded. "Been thinking on that. Their fire's bright. Makes their night vision poor. Snow's falling heavier now, which helps us. But we need a plan that doesn't get your sisters hurt in the crossfire." Rachel's face set with determination. "Tell me what to do. I'm not afraid." "Maybe you should be," Jonas replied, but he began outlining his thoughts. "I can create a distraction, maybe stampede their horses, set their wagon on fire. While they're confused, you could slip in and free your sisters." "The wagon might be locked," Rachel pointed out, "and my sisters, they'll be frightened, maybe tied." Jonas pulled out his knife and handed it to her, handle first, sharp enough to cut any ropes. As for locks, he produced a length of wire from his coat. Learned a few tricks over the years. Here's how to work it. They spent the next hour planning, going over every detail. Jonas taught Rachel how to use the wire to trip a simple lock, how to move quietly through brush, where to run if things went wrong. She absorbed everything with fierce concentration, her fingers working the wire until she could feel the mechanism catch. Night deepened around them, bringing a chorus of coyote cries that seemed to mock their preparations. The snow fell steadily now, coating the ground in white silence. Neither of them could sleep, though they knew they should rest. Instead, They sat close together, sharing warmth and unspoken fears. "Jonas," Rachel said softly as false dawn approached, If something happens to me, promise you'll get my sisters home." "Nothing's going to happen to you," Jonas replied gruffly. "Just stay focused on the plan." But he understood her fear. He felt it himself, a cold weight in his stomach that had nothing to do with the weather. As the eastern sky began to lighten behind its veil of clouds, they made their final preparations. Jonas checked his rifle one last time, then stored it with their horse. It would be too awkward for close work. He kept his knife and an old pistol, hoping he wouldn't need either. Rachel had changed from her dress into a pair of Jonas's old trousers, wrapped a dark shawl around her head to hide her white cap. In the gray dawn light, she looked both younger and older than her years. A girl playing at being a warrior, yet with steel in her spine that many warriors might envy. She took Jonas's hand suddenly, her fingers cold but steady. "The Lord's strength be with you," she whispered, then pressed something into his palm, a small carved wooden cross on a leather cord. It was my grandmother's. For luck. Jonas stared at the simple object, remembering his wife's similar faith in such things. Without a word, he slipped it around his neck and tucked it under his shirt. The wood felt warm against his skin, a reminder of all that rode on the next few hours. They shared a last look, understanding passing between them without words. Then Jonas melted into the snowy shadows, beginning his circuit around the camp. Rachel crouched in their hiding place, waiting for his signal, her heart pounding but her hands steady on the knife he'd given her. The morning light grew stronger, filtering through the falling snow. In the camp below, one of the men emerged from his blankets, cursing the weather. Jonas paused in his approach, watching the man stumble toward the trees to relieve himself. The time for planning was over. Now came the moment when all their hopes hung on courage, skill, and whatever providence Rachel's prayers might summon. Jonas touched the cross beneath his shirt, thinking of 5 little girls who had watched his chimney smoke with such faith. Then he drew his knife and moved forward through the swirling snow, ready to fulfill that faith or die in the attempt. The pale winter dawn crept over the ridge, painting the snow-dusted landscape in shades of pearl and shadow. Jonas crouched behind a fallen pine, his breath misting in the cold air as he surveyed the kidnappers' camp one final time. Below, 3 men huddled around their dying fire, cursing the morning chill. His weathered hands moved carefully, arranging dry brush and pine needles in a precise pattern. The tinder was ready. He'd prepared it the night before, soaking strips of cloth in oil from his kit. Now he worked methodically, building small piles downhill from the camp where the morning breeze would carry the smoke. Rachel waited in position, hidden behind a cluster of rocks near the wagon. Even from this distance, Jonas could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she gripped his knife with white-knuckled determination. He touched the wooden cross beneath his shirt, offering up what might have been a prayer, then struck his flint. The first pile caught quickly, smoke curling up through the trees. Jonas moved silently to the next location, setting another blaze, then another. Within minutes, multiple streams of smoke rose into the dawn sky, creating the illusion of a spreading fire threatening the camp. "Fire!" One of the men spotted the smoke, jumping to his feet. "Down by the creek." "Get water," the man in the cavalry coat ordered, grabbing a bucket. "Move, you idiots." The 3 men scrambled down the slope, leaving their weapons propped against the wagon wheel. Jonas watched Rachel dart from her hiding place, swift and silent as a shadow. She reached the wagon's rear canvas, his wire pick already in her hands. Jonas circled behind the camp, positioning himself between the men and their weapons. The kidnapper in the lead reached the first smoke pile, stomping at flames that weren't there. "It's just brush," he shouted. "Someone's—" Jonas struck before he could finish. Years of wrestling mountain lions had taught him efficiency. One sharp blow to the base of the skull dropped the man without a sound. The second kidnapper turned at the noise, eyes widening in recognition. He took one look at Jonas's face and fled into the trees, leaving his companion behind. The third man, the one in the cavalry coat, proved more dangerous. He spun around, drawing a hidden revolver from his boot. "Should have known someone would come sniffing," he snarled, leveling the weapon at Jonas's chest. Jonas dove forward, slamming his shoulder into the man's midsection. The revolver cracked, the shot going wild. They crashed to the ground, rolling in the snow and dead leaves. The kidnapper was younger, stronger, but Jonas fought with the fury of a man defending what was his. They grappled for control of the gun. Another shot splitting the morning silence. Behind them, Jonas heard the soft sounds of escape. Boots on wooden planks, whispered German, the rustle of canvas. Rachel was getting her sisters out. He just had to keep this man occupied. The kidnapper managed to slam an elbow into Jonas's jaw, making stars explode behind his eyes. The gun swung toward his face. Jonas trapped the man's wrist against the ground, straining to keep the barrel pointed away. Slowly, inexorably, he forced the kidnapper's arm to bend backward until tendons creaked. "Drop it," Jonas growled, "or I'll break it." The man's fingers opened, letting the revolver fall into the snow. Jonas knocked him unconscious with a swift strike, then quickly bound his hands with his own belt. "Jonas," Rachel's urgent whisper carried from the wagon, "we need help." He scrambled up the slope to find Rachel supporting two of her younger sisters who could barely walk after being bound for days. The other two girls clung to each other, tears freezing on their cheeks. All five wore only their thin dresses, completely unsuitable for the weather. "Here." Jonas shrugged out of his coat, wrapping it around the smallest girls. "Rachel, get them to our horse. I'll grab what blankets I can from the wagon." He worked quickly, gathering supplies while Rachel helped her sisters through the trees. The youngest couldn't walk at all. Her feet were nearly frozen. Jonas lifted her gently, cradling her against his chest as they made their escape. They rode double and triple on Jonas's sturdy horse, sharing body heat under stolen blankets. Jonas led them on foot, setting a pace that would put distance between them and the camp without exhausting the girls. He chose their path carefully, using streams and rocky ground to obscure their trail. The winter sun climbed higher, burning off the morning mist. Jonas kept them moving steadily northwest toward his cabin. He watched the girls closely for signs of frostbite or exhaustion, calling brief rests when needed. Rachel divided her attention between soothing her sisters and scanning their back trail for pursuit. "Will they follow?" she asked during one rest stop, her voice low so the others wouldn't hear. Jonas shook his head. "The one who ran might bring help, but the snow will slow them down. We'll be safe at my cabin before they can organize a search." The day wore on, shadows lengthening as the sun began its descent. Jonas's cabin appeared as welcome as any fine house when they finally crossed the last ridge. Smoke still rose from the chimney. He'd banked the fire well before leaving. He helped the girls dismount, carrying the youngest inside while Rachel guided the others. The cabin's single room felt crowded with 6 people, but the warmth from the fireplace soon had color returning to pale cheeks. Jonas busied himself stoking the fire and heating water, while Rachel tended to her sisters. She checked them for injuries, wrapping chilled feet in warm blankets, combing tangles from their hair with gentle fingers. The girls spoke quietly in German, their voices growing stronger as they recovered from their ordeal. "They're hungry," Rachel told him. "We all are." Jonas nodded, pulling out the last of his cornmeal and dried meat. It wasn't much, but combined with the supplies he'd taken from the kidnapper's wagon, they could make a decent meal. He set about cooking while Rachel helped her sisters wash up. The youngest girl, Jonas thought her name was Sarah, stayed close to him as he worked, watching with solemn eyes. She reminded him of a fawn, all legs and uncertainty. When he handed her a tin cup of warm broth, she surprised him by leaning against his side. "Danke," she whispered, "thank you." Evening settled over the cabin like a thick quilt. The girls sat close together near the hearth, sharing the simple meal of cornbread and stew. Their faces glowed in the firelight, exhaustion warring with relief. Rachel moved among them like a mother hen, making sure each ate enough. When the bowls were empty and the fire burned low, Rachel gathered her sisters close. Their voices rose in harmony, a hymn that Jonas didn't recognize but felt in his bones. The German words filled his cabin with something he'd thought forever lost, the sound of family, of belonging. He sat in his old chair watching them sing. The wooden cross still hung against his chest, a reminder of faith freely given. The cabin that had seemed so empty now felt full to bursting with life and trust and possibility. The girls' voices faded into sleepy murmurs. Jonas helped Rachel arrange blankets on the floor, creating soft nests near the fire. One by one, the younger sisters drifted off to sleep, their faces peaceful for the first time in days. Rachel took the last watch with Jonas, both of them knowing that danger might still find them. But for now, in this moment, his cabin sheltered something precious. Jonas felt it in the steady breathing of sleeping children, in Rachel's quiet presence beside him, in the way the fire's warmth seemed to reach past his skin to touch something long frozen in his heart. Morning light filtered through Jonas's cabin windows, casting warm squares on the rough-hewn floor where the 4 younger girls still slept, bundled in blankets near the dying fire. Rachel was already up, moving quietly as she added wood to the hearth. The flames caught and crackled, sending new warmth through the small space. Jonas sat at his table, watching this unfamiliar scene unfold in his home. His single room, usually so empty and silent, now held the gentle sounds of sleeping children and the soft movements of domestic life. It felt strange, yet something in his chest ached at the rightness of it. "We'll need more water," Rachel whispered, careful not to wake her sisters. "For washing and cooking both." Jonas nodded, reaching for his coat. "I'll fetch it. Creek's not far." "Let me help," Rachel insisted, already wrapping herself in one of the blankets they'd taken from the kidnapper's wagon. "We can carry more together." Outside, the world had transformed overnight. Fresh snow lay thick on the ground, pristine and untouched. Their boots crunched through the new powder as they made their way to the creek, each carrying 2 buckets. The morning air bit sharp and clean in their lungs. "Your sister's sleep sound," Jonas commented, breaking trail through the snow. Rachel smiled, adjusting her grip on the bucket handles. "They feel safe here. With you." She paused, looking at him directly. "We all do." Jonas felt his cheeks warm, and not from the cold. He busied himself breaking the creek's thin ice and filling the buckets. The water ran clear and swift beneath the surface, singing its endless song against the stones. When they returned, the younger girls were stirring. Sarah, the smallest, sat up first, rubbing sleep from her eyes. Her face brightened when she saw Jonas, showing no fear of the gruff mountain man who had carried her to safety the day before. "Good morning," she said shyly, using one of the few English words she knew. Jonas found himself smiling back. "Morning, little one." The other girls woke gradually, speaking soft German among themselves as they helped Rachel with morning tasks. Jonas marveled at how naturally they fell into a routine, as though they'd lived in his cabin forever instead of just one night. Rachel discovered his small store of cornmeal and dried beans, supplemented by what they'd taken from the kidnapper's supplies. She set about making breakfast while her sisters tidied the sleeping area, folding blankets with careful hands. 2 of the girls, Hannah and Mary, ventured outside to fetch more firewood from Jonas's stockpile. They returned rosy-cheeked and giggling, their arms full of split logs. The sound of their laughter seemed to fill every corner of the cabin, chasing away years of silence. Jonas found himself watching them all, these 5 sisters who had transformed his space overnight. They moved with the easy grace of those accustomed to working together, sharing tasks and quiet words. Even the youngest helped, carrying kindling to the wood box 1 stick at a time. Rachel borrowed his largest kettle, setting water to heat for washing. Steam rose from the pot, fogging the window glass. The familiar sense of cooking began to fill the air. Cornbread baking in the Dutch oven, beans simmering with dried meat. "We haven't had a proper meal since," Rachel's voice trailed off, her hands stilling on the spoon she stirred with. Jonas understood. The memory of their captivity was still too fresh, too raw. He moved to stand beside her at the hearth, careful to give her space. "Plenty here," he said gruffly. "Eat what you need." Rachel's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but she nodded, returning to her cooking with renewed purpose. Behind them, her sisters had begun to sing as they worked, a hymn in German, their voices rising sweet and clear in the morning air. Jonas recognized the melody from church services long ago, before grief had driven him to the mountains. The words were foreign to him, but the feeling they carried was universal. Gratitude, hope, the comfort of family gathered close. As the day progressed, the cabin grew warmer with activity. The girls found ways to help, eager to repay Jonas's kindness. They swept the plank floor with a borrowed broom, arranged his few dishes on their shelf, fetched more water when needed. Their presence seemed to soften the cabin's rough edges, making it feel more like a home than it had in years. Jonas watched them work, feeling both awkward and grateful. He wasn't used to so much movement in his space, so many voices and helping hands. Yet something in him responded to their industry, their simple acceptance of him as protector and provider. By afternoon, snow began falling again outside the windows. The thick flakes drifted past like feathers, building new drifts against the cabin walls. Jonas added wood to the fire, knowing they were sealed in together for at least another day. Rachel's sisters gathered at the window to watch the snow, pressing their faces close to the glass. Their breath left fog patches that they drew pictures in with careful fingers. Even this simple play seemed to delight them, earning giggles and whispered conversations. They needed this, Rachel said softly, coming to stand beside Jonas. A chance to be children again, not afraid. Jonas nodded, understanding more than he could say. He too had needed this, though he hadn't known it until now. The warmth of others around him, the sounds of life and laughter, the simple act of caring for those who needed him. As evening approached, Rachel set about preparing their supper. She worked confidently with Jonas's simple provisions, creating a meal that filled the cabin with savory aromas. Her sisters helped where they could, setting out tin plates and cups, fetching water when needed. Jonas felt awkward, unused to being served in his own home, but Rachel wouldn't hear of him doing without. "You've given us safety," she insisted, filling his plate with steaming food. "Let us give you this." They ate together around Jonas's small table, the younger girls seated on boxes and borrowed blankets. The food was simple, beans and cornbread again, with dried fruit Jonas had been saving for winter. But shared among them, it tasted like a feast. After the meal, Rachel's sisters helped clean up, washing dishes with heated water and drying them carefully. They worked together smoothly, passing plates and cups from hand to hand, singing softly as they did. As night drew in, Jonas lit his lamp, setting it on the table where its gentle light filled the cabin. The girls gathered near the hearth again, settling into their blanket nests for the evening. But they didn't sleep right away. Rachel began to hum, a melody Jonas hadn't heard before. Her sisters joined in, adding words in German that spoke of faith and family. The hymn filled the small space with harmony, each voice finding its place in the whole. To Jonas's surprise, he found himself humming along. The tune was simple enough to follow, and something in him responded to its message of hope. His deep voice blended with their lighter ones, rough but sincere. Rachel smiled at him across the lamplight, approval shining in her eyes. She taught him some of the German words, patient with his clumsy pronunciation. Her sisters giggled when he stumbled, but there was no mockery in their laughter, only joy in sharing something precious. Outside, snow continued to fall, building soft walls of white around the cabin, but inside, warmth and light held sway. The fire crackled in the hearth, sending shadows dancing on the walls. The lamp cast its gentle glow over the scene, the girls in their blankets, Rachel's serene face, Jonas in his chair by the fire. For the first time in years, Jonas felt something stir in his heart. Not the familiar ache of loss, but a new feeling, tentative as a spring shoot pushing through snow. Hope, he realized. Hope for something beyond the solitude he'd wrapped around himself like armor. He watched the firelight play across the faces of these unexpected guests who had become, in just 2 days, something like family. Their trust in him, their simple acceptance of his protection, had awakened something he'd thought like long dead. Rachel caught his eye and smiled, understanding in her gaze. "Thank you," she said softly, her words carrying more than simple gratitude. "For everything." Jonas nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. But as the girls' voices rose again in another hymn, he found himself joining in, letting the music wash away years of silence and solitude. The peace of the previous evening shattered with the first light of dawn. Jonas woke to the thunder of hoofbeats approaching his cabin, the sound echoing off the snow-covered hills. The girls, still wrapped in their blankets near the hearth, stirred at the commotion. Rachel was the first to her feet, moving to the frost-covered window. Her face paled. "Men are coming. Many of them." Jonas grabbed his coat, knowing trouble had found them. "Stay inside," he ordered. But before he could reach the door, it burst open. Deputy Rollins stood in the doorway, his badge catching the early morning light. Behind him, Caldwell's well-polished boots stepped onto Jonas's rough wooden floor. 6 armed townsmen crowded the yard, their breath steaming in the cold air. "Jonas Kipp," Rollins announced, hand resting on his holstered revolver. "You're under arrest for the abduction of these here Amish girls." The youngest sister began to cry. Rachel stepped forward, her voice steady despite her fear. "No! He rescued us. It was Caldwell's men who—" "Quiet." Caldwell's command cut through her words. His smile was cold as the morning frost. "These poor children have clearly been frightened into defending their captor." 2 townsmen seized Jonas's arms before he could speak. They dragged him into the yard, snow crunching beneath their boots. The cold bit through his shirt as they forced his hands behind his back. Iron shackles clicked shut around his wrists, the metal burning with winter's chill. Rachel and her sisters spilled out of the cabin, their voices rising in protest. "Please, you must listen. Jonas saved us from—" "From what?" Caldwell's smooth voice carried false concern. "From your father's rightful decision to sell his land? From progress?" He turned to address the gathered men. This mountain hermit filled their heads with fears, turned them against their own family. Through the crowd, Jonas spotted a familiar figure, Rachel's father, standing apart, his eyes downcast. The man's clothes were rumpled, his breath carrying the sour smell of whiskey. Shame radiated from his hunched shoulders. "Tell them," Rachel pleaded with her father. "Tell them what really happened." But her father wouldn't meet her gaze. His hands trembled as he pulled a folded paper from his coat. A contract, Jonas realized with sinking heart. Caldwell stepped forward, every inch the concerned citizen. "Your father has already signed over the land, my dear, for a very fair price. He understands what's best for his family." The railroad agent's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Now, we'll take custody of you girls, ensure you're properly cared for while this criminal faces justice." The deputy yanked Jonas toward his horse. Rachel tried to follow, but 2 townsmen held her back. Her sisters huddled together, tears freezing on their cheeks in the bitter morning air. "You can't do this," Rachel's voice cracked with desperation. "Father, please, don't let them take our land." But her father stood frozen, the signed contract clutched in his trembling hands. Jonas could see the battle in the man's face, shame warring with fear, courage drowning in whiskey and manipulation. The ride into town was a blur of cold and pain. Jonas's hands had gone numb in the shackles by the time they reached the jail. Townsfolk gathered to watch as Deputy Rollins marched him inside, their faces hard with judgment. "Kidnapper, he ought to hang him." Always knew that Mountain Man was trouble. The cell door clanged shut, the sound echoing with finality. Jonas stood at the bars, watching Rollins settle behind his desk with a self-satisfied smile. "Reckon you'll have plenty of time to think about your sins before the judge arrives," the deputy said, pointedly checking his revolver. "Might want to pray for mercy." Pray. Jonas hadn't truly prayed in years, not since Sarah died. He'd turned his back on God then, buried his faith beneath grief and solitude. Now, listening to the townspeople's jeers through the jail window, he wondered if God had finally turned his back in return. The day crawled past. Jonas paced his cell 7 steps each way, unable to rest. His thoughts kept returning to Rachel and her sisters. What would Caldwell do with them now? The man's cruel smile haunted him, speaking of victories won through whiskey and lies. As evening approached, the deputy's office filled with more townsmen. They passed a bottle, sharing exaggerated tales of Jonas's supposed crimes. Each version grew darker, twisting his attempt at rescue into something sinister. "Saw him watching them girls for weeks," one man claimed, "lurking up on that ridge like a wolf." "Probably been planning it all along," another added, "using that cabin of his to hide who knows what evil." Jonas slumped onto the cell's narrow cot, their words beating against him like hail. He'd tried to do right, to protect the innocent, but here he sat in chains while the true predators walked free, their pockets heavy with stolen land and broken promises. The cell grew colder as night fell. Jonas pulled his thin blanket closer, remembering the warmth of his cabin the night before, the girls singing, Rachel's quiet strength, the hope that had begun to bloom in his heart. All of it stripped away in a single morning. He closed his eyes, exhaustion and despair weighing heavy. The darkness behind his eyelids matched the emptiness in his soul. Had he abandoned God long ago? Or had God abandoned him? The question echoed in his mind, unanswered. From somewhere in the night came the faint sound of singing, a hymn in German, carried on the winter wind. Jonas pressed his face to the bars, straining to hear. Was it real, or just a memory tormenting him? The melody faded before he could be sure. Deputy Rollins looked up from his desk, irritation crossing his face. Best get some sleep, Kip. Tomorrow ain't likely to be any kinder to you. Jonas retreated to his cot, but sleep wouldn't come. The cold iron of the shackles bit into his wrists, a constant reminder of how quickly hope could turn to ashes. Outside his cell, the deputy's lamp cast dancing shadows on the wall, like the firelight in his cabin, but twisted now into shapes that mocked his failure. The night stretched endless before him, filled with the weight of broken trust and stolen dreams. In the darkness, Jonas wrestled with his doubts, his faith, and the bitter taste of injustice. Prayer stuck in his throat like thorns, unable to find its way past years of silence between him and God. The night pressed cold against Jonas's skin as he lay on the hard jail cot. Moonlight filtered through the barred window, casting shadows that danced like memories across the floor. His late wife Sarah's face kept appearing in his dreams, not as she was in her final days, but as she had been in their early years together. Her smile bright, her faith unwavering. "You always said God had a purpose," he whispered to the darkness, even when I couldn't see it. The cell's chill seeped into his bones. Deputy Rollins snored at his desk, a half-empty whiskey bottle by his hand. Outside, the town slept, unaware of the injustice that had taken root in their midst. Jonas dozed fitfully, his dreams a tangle of past and present. Sarah stood in their cabin doorway, holding a paper in her hand. "The water rights," she said, but her voice faded like morning mist. He startled awake, his heart pounding, unsure why that detail seemed important. Dawn crept over the mountains, painting the jail walls with pale light. Jonas sat up, his muscles stiff from the thin mattress. The deputy stirred, grumbling as he straightened in his chair. Voices drifted through the window, women's voices, familiar and determined. Jonas moved to the bars, straining to see. Rachel stood in the street below, her white cap bright in the morning sun. Beside her was an older woman Jonas hadn't seen in years, her mother, Anna. Their presence drew curious townsfolk from their shops and homes. "Please," Rachel called out, her voice clear and strong, "the preacher must hear us. What's been done here isn't right in God's eyes." Reverend Martin emerged from the church across the street, his Bible clutched to his chest like a shield. He approached cautiously, glancing toward the railroad office where Caldwell kept his desk. "Child," the preacher said, his voice gentle but uncertain, "these are complicated matters. The railroad brings progress, jobs." "It brings lies," Rachel interrupted, standing straighter, "and theft wrapped in false papers. Will you not hear the truth?" More townspeople gathered, forming a circle around the scene. Jonas could see the division in their faces, some nodding at Rachel's words, others frowning and muttering about progress. "Truth belongs to God, not men," Rachel declared, her voice carrying across the morning air. "Not to Mr. Caldwell, not to those who took our sisters, and not to those who would steal our land with whiskey and threats." The preacher shifted uncomfortably, but something in Rachel's words seemed to reach him. He squared his shoulders, looking more closely at the young woman before him. "Speak then," he said finally. "Tell us what really happened." Anna stepped forward, her quiet dignity drawing all eyes. "Our daughters were taken," she began, "not by Jonas Kipp, but by men working for Mr. Caldwell. They tried to force us from our land when my husband wouldn't sell." Jonas pressed closer to the bars, watching the crowd's reaction. Some faces softened with doubt, while others hardened with denial. The deputy stood from his desk, moving to the jail door with his hand on his gun belt. "That's quite enough," Caldwell's voice cut through the murmurs. He strode from his office, polished boots clicking on the wooden sidewalk. "These people are clearly confused. The contract was signed fairly. After you plied my husband with whiskey, Anna said firmly. After you threatened our children. The crowd stirred, uncomfortable whispers spreading. The preacher looked between Caldwell and the Amish women, his conscience visibly wrestling with his fear. Suddenly, Anna's eyes widened. The water rights, she breathed, echoing Jonas's dream. Sarah, Jonas's wife, she filed a paper about water rights on that land. Years ago, before she passed. Jonas felt his heart skip. Sarah had always been the one to handle legal matters, insisting on proper documentation even when he saw no need. What paper? Caldwell demanded, his smooth facade cracking slightly. The courthouse will have records, Anna said. Sarah Kipp was thorough in all things. She knew that land's water source fed both properties, hers and what would become ours. She made sure it was protected. Rachel turned to the preacher, hope blazing in her eyes. Will you help us search the records? Surely God's truth can be found in those pages. Reverend Martin straightened, finally finding his courage. Yes, he said firmly. We'll go now, before any more records might disappear. Caldwell's face darkened. Now see here. But the preacher raised his voice, addressing the crowd. Who among you will stand witness to this search? Let us see what God's light reveals in those dusty books. Several townspeople stepped forward, including the courthouse clerk who had been listening from his doorway. The tide was turning, ever so slightly, away from Caldwell's influence. Jonas watched through the bars as Rachel, her mother, and the preacher hurried toward the courthouse, followed by a growing group of curious citizens. His heart pounded with a mixture of hope and fear. Sarah had always said their land's water was precious. Had she truly found a way to protect it, even after death? The deputy paced nervously, caught between his loyalty to Caldwell and the shifting mood of the town. Outside, the morning sun climbed higher, promising to reveal what darkness had hidden. Through the jail window, Jonas could hear the murmur of voices from the courthouse next door. Pages turning, documents being shuffled, truth waiting to be uncovered. He closed his eyes, offering up his first real prayer in years. Sarah, he whispered, you always saw further ahead than me. Please let your foresight help us now. The morning stretched on, each minute feeling like an hour as Jonas waited for word from the courthouse. In his cell, that spark of faith his wife had tried so hard to nurture began to flicker back to life, warming him more than any blanket could. The courthouse's heavy oak door groaned as Rachel and her mother entered, followed by Reverend Martin and several townsfolk. Dust motes danced in shafts of morning light streaming through tall windows. The clerk, Mr. Peterson, looked up from his desk, startled by the sudden crowd in his usually quiet domain. We need to see the land records, Anna said firmly, her plain black dress and white cap standing out among the townspeople's colorful attire. From 8 years past, when Sarah Kipp was alive. Peterson adjusted his wire-rimmed spectacles, glancing nervously at the growing number of observers. That's quite a request, ma'am. Those records aren't organized as well as they ought to be. Then we'll help search, Rachel declared, stepping forward. Her voice carried the same quiet strength as her mother's. Every page, if we must. The clerk hesitated, but Reverend Martin placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. This is a matter of justice, Thomas. The Lord's work often requires patience. Peterson nodded slowly, then stood and shuffled toward a door marked Records. He returned with several leather-bound volumes and boxes of loose papers, their edges yellow with age. Water rights would be in the property ledgers, he explained, setting them on a large table, or possibly among the miscellaneous deeds. It'll take hours to go through it all. Rachel rolled up her sleeves, determination bright in her eyes. Then we'd best begin. The search party organized itself naturally. Anna and Rachel took the oldest ledgers, their fingers trailing down columns of faded ink. The preacher and Peterson focused on loose documents, while other townspeople sorted through remaining volumes. The only sounds were rustling pages and occasional murmurs of, "No, not here," or "Check this date." Hours passed. The morning sun climbed higher, heating the courthouse's stuffy air. Some observers drifted away, but others arrived, drawn by word spreading through town. Even those who had doubted Jonas's innocence were curious about what might be found. In his jail cell, Jonas paced the narrow space, 7 steps forward, 7 steps back. The same pattern he'd walked 100 times since dawn. But this time, something was different. His lips moved silently, forming words he hadn't spoken in years. "Lord," he whispered, "I ain't asked for nothing since Sarah passed. Didn't see the point. But them girls," he swallowed hard, "they need your help more than I ever did. Keep them safe. Show us the way." The deputy watched him uneasily from his desk, perhaps sensing the shift in the air. Outside, the town hummed with tension and possibility. Back in the courthouse, Rachel's eyes burned from straining to read cramped handwriting. Her mother worked beside her, just as tired, but equally determined. The pile of searched documents grew steadily, hope fading with each fruitless page. "Wait," Peterson called out suddenly, his voice sharp with excitement. He held up a folded paper, its corners worn smooth with age. "I think, yes, this is Sarah Kipp's signature." The group crowded around as he carefully unfolded the document. Rachel held her breath as the clerk adjusted his spectacles and began to read. "This deed, dated April 15, 1875, grants and secures water rights to the stream crossing sections 12 and 13. Peterson's eyes widened. "It's a legal claim to the water source that feeds both properties. Sarah Kipp filed it properly, had it witnessed and everything." Anna smiled softly. She knew the value of that stream. Knew others might try to take it someday. The preacher leaned closer, examining the paper. "This means Caldwell can't seize the land without securing new water rights. And since the stream's already legally claimed." "He can't build there," Rachel finished, her heart pounding. "Not without our permission, not without Jonas's." More townspeople pressed into the courthouse as word spread. The document passed carefully from hand to hand, each person verifying its authenticity. Peterson pulled out current maps, confirming the stream still crossed the same sections of land. "It's valid," he announced finally. "Never superseded or challenged. The water rights belong to the Kipp property, with usage rights extending to the adjacent farm." Rachel grabbed the deed, her fingers trembling slightly. "We have to show the deputy, now." The crowd followed as Rachel hurried toward the jail, her mother and the preacher close behind. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the street. Inside his cell, Jonas heard the approaching footsteps and voices. Deputy Rollins stood as Rachel burst through the door, the gathered townsfolk filling the space behind her. She thrust the document toward him. "Read it," she demanded. "Read it aloud so everyone can hear." The deputy took the paper reluctantly, his face paling as he scanned its contents. His voice shook slightly as he read the legal language confirming Sarah Kipp's claim to the water rights. "This deed prevents any development that would interfere with the stream's natural course," he finished. It's still binding." The crowd murmured, the tide of opinion visibly turning. Neighbors who had condemned Jonas that morning now looked uncertain, then ashamed. The deputy's hand trembled as he set the document on his desk. "Caldwell knew," someone in the crowd said. "Had to have checked the records before trying to buy the land. That's why he used whiskey and threats instead of proper contracts." Jonas stood silent at his cell door, watching the deputy's internal struggle play across his face. Rollins had tied himself to Caldwell's schemes, but he was no hardened criminal. Just a man who'd chosen the wrong side and now had to live with it. The crowd's energy shifted, anger finding a new target. "Where's Caldwell?" several voices demanded. "Fetch him here." "No need," came a smooth voice from the doorway. Caldwell himself stepped into the jail, his usual confident smile now forced. "I'm sure this is all a misunderstanding." Rachel held up the deed. "The only misunderstanding was thinking you could steal our land and get away with it." The railroad agent's facade cracked slightly. His eyes darted between the deputy, the crowd, and the damning document in Rachel's hand. For the first time, he looked uncertain. Jonas spoke then, his voice rough from disuse but carrying clearly through the crowded jail. "Sarah always said that stream was a blessing. Reckon she made sure it'd keep blessing folks long after she was gone." The deputy finally straightened, duty winning out over fear. He pulled out his keys, the iron ring jangling in the tense silence. "Mr. Caldwell," Rollins said, unlocking Jonas's cell, "I believe we need to have a serious discussion about your recent activities in this town." The crowd pressed closer, their combined presence preventing any thought of escape. Caldwell's smooth manner crumbled entirely as he realized his careful plans had been undone by a single document, filed by a frontier woman who had seen clearer than anyone what the future might bring. Jonas stepped out of his cell, free in more ways than one. Rachel caught his eye and smiled, a look of shared understanding passing between them. Her mother stood nearby, tears flowing freely down her weathered cheeks. The afternoon light slanted through the jail's windows, touching each face in the crowded room. In that moment, Jonas felt Sarah's presence more strongly than he had in years, not in grief or loneliness, but in gratitude for her foresight and faith. The stream she had protected would continue to flow, nurturing not just the land but the bonds between neighbors. Her final gift had brought justice, and with it, the beginning of healing for both Jonas and the community she had left behind. The deputy began writing in his ledger, documenting the day's revelations. Outside, the town buzzed with the news, truth spreading as naturally as water finding its course. Inside the jail, Jonas stood tall, surrounded by those who now saw him through new eyes, not as a suspicious recluse, but as a man who had helped protect an Amish family when they needed it most. Rachel carefully folded the precious deed, her fingers tracing its aged creases. The paper that had seemed so ordinary in the dusty courthouse now felt sacred, a testament to one woman's wisdom and another's courage to uncover it. The gathered townsfolk began to disperse, their conversations a mix of amazement at Sarah's foresight and shame at how quickly they had judged Jonas. The truth had been waiting in those courthouse records all along, as patient as the stream itself, until the right moment to emerge. Caldwell's face twisted with fury as he watched his careful plans crumble. He stormed out of the jail, boots striking the wooden sidewalk with sharp cracks. The crowd parted, their earlier boldness wavering at his obvious rage. Jonas followed him outside, Rachel and her family close behind. The railroad agent's voice rang across the street, "Thompson, Miller, get over here!" From the saloon emerged three rough-looking men, their hands hovering near their gun belts. They swaggered toward Caldwell, spreading out to flank him. More figures appeared from the alleyways, hired muscle waiting for just such a moment. The deputy stepped forward, one hand on his own weapon. "Now see here, Caldwell." "Save your breath," Caldwell snapped. "That water rights claim is worthless without enforcement. And who's going to enforce it? You?" He laughed harshly. "Against the railroad's interests?" The gathered townspeople shifted uneasily, some backing away from the growing tension. Rachel's father moved to shield his daughters, his face pale but determined. Jonas stood perfectly still, studying Caldwell's men. He'd faced worse odds in the mountains, but never with innocent lives at stake. His fingers itched to curl into fists, but he remembered Rachel's quiet strength, her faith in something greater than violence. "Ain't about enforcement," Jonas said quietly. "It's about right and wrong. You know which side you're standing on." Caldwell's sneer deepened. "Right and wrong? This is business, you fool. Progress. The railroad needs that land, and it'll have it." He nodded to his men. "Show them what happens to people who stand in the way of progress." The hired thugs advanced, pushing through the crowd toward the Amish family. Several townspeople protested, but quickly fell back when met with threatening glares. Jonas stepped between them and Rachel's family, his voice steady. "You touch any of them, you'll answer to me." "And to God," Rachel added firmly, moving to stand beside him. Then, clear and pure as mountain water, a song rose in the tense air. Rachel had begun to sing, her voice carrying the ancient words of a hymn. Her sisters joined in, their harmony spreading across the street like ripples on a pond. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. The simple melody caught the attention of everyone present. Even Caldwell's men hesitated, something uncertain crossing their faces as the girls' voices blended in perfect faith. "That saved a wretch like me." More voices joined in, first Rachel's mother, then other townspeople who knew the hymn. The sound swelled, filling the street with its gentle power. "I once was lost, but now am found." Jonas felt the vibration in his chest, remembering Sarah singing this very hymn as she worked in their cabin. His own rough voice joined the chorus, surprising him with its strength. "Was blind, but now I see." Caldwell's men lowered their hands from their weapons, looking uncomfortable. A few stepped back, no longer eager to threaten a family whose faith rang out so clearly. The preacher finally pushed through the crowd, his Bible clutched in weathered hands. The singing faded as he faced Caldwell directly. "I've been silent too long," he declared, his voice carrying the weight of his office. "Watched too many good people suffer while evil men prospered. But God's justice cannot be bought or buried in courthouse records." He opened his Bible, pages rustling in the afternoon breeze. "The Lord says, 'Woe to those who make unjust laws, to those who issue oppressive decrees, to deprive the poor of their rights and withhold justice from the oppressed.'" The words struck home. Several of Caldwell's men removed their hats, looking ashamed. The townspeople pressed closer, no longer afraid. "You've used fear and whiskey to steal what isn't yours," the preacher continued. "Threatened children of God for your own gain. But here is where it stops." Caldwell's face had grown red with rage and embarrassment. "You're all fools. The railroad can't be stopped by hymns and Bible verses." "No," Jonas agreed quietly, "but it can be stopped by truth, and by people standing together against men like you." As if to prove his words, the townsfolk moved forward as one, forming a wall between Caldwell and the Amish family. Faces that had looked at Jonas with suspicion now showed solidarity. Hands that had pointed in accusation now reached out in support. The deputy stepped forward again, this time with purpose. "Mr. Caldwell, I'm charging you with attempted theft, fraud, and kidnapping. Your men are welcome to join you in my jail if they'd like to continue this discussion." Caldwell's hired muscle exchanged glances, then began backing away. They might be willing to rough up farmers for pay, but facing criminal charges was another matter. Within moments, they had melted back into the alleys, leaving their employer alone. "You can't do this," Caldwell sputtered, but his voice had lost its authority. The railroad will find another route," the preacher interrupted. "One that doesn't require stealing from honest folk. God's justice has spoken here today." The deputy moved to take Caldwell into custody. The railroad agent's shoulders slumped as the iron cuffs clicked shut, his carefully constructed scheme collapsing completely. As he was led away, the gathered crowd began to disperse. Many stopped to shake Jonas's hand or apologize for their earlier doubts. Rachel's father approached him slowly, shame evident in his bearing. "I was weak," he admitted. "Let fear and drink cloud my judgment. Can you forgive me?" Jonas looked at the man's weathered face, seeing his own struggles reflected there. "Ain't my forgiveness you need," he said gently, "but you've got it all the same." Rachel and her sisters surrounded their father, their love evident even through their plain ways. The youngest began humming another hymn, and soon they were all singing again, their voices carrying healing in every note. Jonas stood in the middle of the street, amazed at how everything had changed, not through violence or vengeance, but through faith and the courage to stand firm in what was right. Sarah would have understood, had understood, when she filed those water rights so long ago. The preacher approached him, Bible still in hand. "You showed us all something today, Jonas. Sometimes the strongest weapon against evil isn't a gun or a fist. It's the simple truth, spoken in love." Jonas nodded, watching as the town slowly returned to its normal rhythm. But something had shifted, like spring ice breaking up on the river. The community had faced a test and found its better nature, guided by the pure voices of children and the enduring power of faith. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the street, touching each face with golden light. Where there had been division, now stood unity. Where suspicion had ruled, trust began to grow. And in Jonas's heart, a warmth he had thought forever lost began to kindle again, sparked by 5 young voices raised in praise of something greater than themselves. Morning sunlight sparkled across the fresh-fallen snow, turning the world into a blanket of diamonds. Jonas guided his horse alongside the wagon, carrying Rachel's family, their breath forming white clouds in the crisp air. The crunch of hooves and wheels through snow marked their steady progress toward the Amish farm. Rachel sat beside her father, who held the reins with hands that trembled slightly. The younger girls huddled under thick quilts in the wagon bed, occasionally breaking into soft giggles or whispered hymns. Their mother kept a watchful eye on everyone, her face serene despite the cold. As they crested the final rise, the farmhouse came into view. Snow draped every fence post and roof beam, but smoke rose steadily from the chimney where neighbors had kept the home fires burning. The sight brought tears to Rachel's mother's eyes. "Home," she whispered, reaching to squeeze her husband's arm. They pulled up to the barn where Jonas dismounted to help with the horses. The girls tumbled from the wagon, their boots making fresh tracks in the pristine snow. Their laughter echoed across the white fields as they raced toward the house. Rachel's father stood awkwardly by the wagon wheel watching Jonas work. "I failed them," he said quietly. "When those men came, when Caldwell pressed that whiskey on me, I was weak. But you stood strong when I could not." Jonas paused in unhitching the team. "Ain't about being strong," he said, "just about doing what needs doing." Nevertheless, the father extended his hand. "Thank you for protecting my family when I could not." Jonas clasped the offered hand, feeling the calluses of honest work beneath his grip. No more words were needed between them. Rachel's mother appeared in the barn doorway, her arms wrapped in a shawl. "The fire is built up and I have stew warming," she announced. "Jonas, you will join us." It wasn't a question. Jonas found himself nodding, unable to refuse the quiet authority in her voice. Inside, the farmhouse glowed with warmth and life. The younger girls had already set the table with bowls and spoons, while Rachel stirred a pot of fragrant stew. The windows steamed with cooking heat, creating a cozy barrier against the winter world outside. "Sit," Rachel's mother instructed, gesturing Jonas toward the table. "You are family now, not a guest." Jonas hesitated, his throat tight with unexpected emotion. "Ma'am, Anna," she corrected gently, "and I will hear no arguments. You saved my children twice now, once in that long-ago blizzard, though you did not know it, and again these past days. God's hand moves through you whether you see it or not." The youngest girl tugged at Jonas's sleeve. "Sit by me," she pleaded, her face bright with trust. Jonas found himself settled at the table, surrounded by the family. Rachel's father said grace in German, his voice steady now. Then bowls were filled with steaming stew. Thick slices of fresh bread passed hand to hand. The meal passed in a blur of warmth and conversation. The girls chattered about chores to be done, lessons to resume, life returning to its proper rhythm. Their mother spoke of spring planting, while their father discussed repairs needed after the winter storms. Jonas listened, amazed at how naturally they included him in their plans. "The barn roof will need patching," the father would say, glancing his way. "With 2 men, it will go faster." "And you must teach the girls about the herbs that grow in your valley," Anna added. "Rachel says you know where the best ones grow." "I reckon I do," Jonas admitted, something easing in his chest. As evening drew in, lanterns were lit and the family gathered near the hearth. The youngest girls worked on their sewing while Rachel read aloud from the family Bible. Jonas sat in a corner chair, watching the firelight play across their faces. He thought of his own cabin, standing empty in the growing dark. For years, its solitude had been his comfort. Now, surrounded by the quiet industry of family life, he realized how hollow that comfort had been. "You will stay near us," Anna said softly, pausing beside his chair. "The old Weber place just over the rise. It needs a good hand to work it. The land is still sound, though the house wants fixing." Jonas looked up at her, knowing smile. "Reckon that might suit," he said carefully. "Good." She patted his shoulder. "A man should not be alone. God knows this. Why else would he bring you to us?" The fire crackled warmly as the family's quiet activities continued around him. Outside, snow began falling again, but its isolation could no longer touch the warmth within. Jonas settled deeper into his chair, no longer a stranger, no longer alone. The winter winds howled across the Colorado plains, but Jonas no longer felt their bite as keenly. Each morning, he rose before dawn to trek through knee-deep snow to the Amish homestead. His axe rang against fallen trees, splitting logs for both his cabin and theirs. The work felt different now, purposeful, shared. The 4 younger girls arrived at his cabin like clockwork, their white caps bobbing through the drifts. They swept his floors, tidied his shelves, and filled his home with chatter that no longer seemed intrusive. The youngest would often hum hymns while working, her clear voice making the cabin feel less empty. "You need curtains," the second youngest declared one morning, hands on her hips, "and proper dishes, not just tin." Jonas found himself chuckling more these days. "Reckon you might be right about that." Rachel usually came last after seeing to her family's morning needs. She brought fresh bread or soup, insisting Jonas needed more than just beans and coffee. They would sit by his fire, talking of things that mattered. "I dream of building a school," she told him one afternoon, her eyes bright with purpose. "Not just for our people, but for everyone's children. The English families west of here have no teacher, and our little ones could learn alongside theirs." Jonas watched her animate the vision with her hands, describing where the schoolhouse might stand, how the children would sit together regardless of their dress or ways. Her passion stirred something in him, a desire to build more than just fences and barns. "Been thinking myself," he admitted slowly, stoking the fire, "about maybe raising some cattle come spring. Getting a proper herd started." He paused, then added softly, "Ain't much point in dreams if you're alone." Rachel's smile warmed the room more than any fire could. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching flames dance and listening to the wind. Sometimes they prayed, Rachel's gentle German words mixing with Jonas's rusty English ones. Other times they just shared stories, of his wife, of her mother's journey west, of the lives that had led them both to this unexpected place. Together they found laughter came easier than before. Hope, too, grew stronger with each passing day, like early spring flowers pushing through winter's snow. The first warm breeze of spring rustled through the valley as a line of wagons wound their way toward Jonas's cabin. He stood on his porch, watching dust rise from their wheels. Townfolk he barely knew brought sacks of flour, dried goods, and even lengths of cloth for the Amish family. Sheriff Rollins dismounted first, his hat in his hands. "We done you wrong, Kip," he said, voice gruff with shame. "Shouldn't have listened to Caldwell's lies." One by one, the townsfolk stepped forward. Women who had whispered behind their hands now offered fresh-baked bread. Men who had sneered at him extended calloused hands in friendship. The preacher approached last, his shoulders bent with regret. "I failed in my duty to seek truth before judgment," he said, meeting Jonas's eyes. "Can you find it in your heart to forgive us?" Jonas felt the weight of their words. The ordeal had left its mark. Nights in that cold cell, the sting of false accusations. Yet as he looked at their faces, he remembered Rachel's quiet strength, her unwavering faith in justice tempered by mercy. "Ain't no man perfect," Jonas said finally. "Reckon we all need forgiveness sometimes." As evening approached, the younger girls gathered near his cabin, their voices rising in familiar hymns. The sound drifted across the valley, clear and sweet. Jonas stood listening, remembering how their watching had once unsettled him. Now their presence brought comfort, turning his lonely refuge into something more. Inside his cabin, changes small and large marked their influence. Curtains at the windows, a quilt across his bed, fresh flowers in a jar. The walls that had once echoed with silence now held memories of laughter and prayer. His home had become a place of welcome, of family found rather than born. The girls' voices soared into the dusk, no longer watching but celebrating. Jonas bowed his head, grateful for the mercy that had brought healing to them all. Easter morning dawned bright and clear over the Colorado Valley. Jonas stood before his cabin's small mirror, carefully dragging the razor across his weathered cheeks. His hands, normally steady with trap lines and rifle, trembled slightly as he prepared for church. The one-room chapel sat nestled among budding aspens, its whitewashed walls gleaming in the spring sunshine. Townsfolk and the Amish family filed in together, their Sunday best a mixture of plain dark cloth and colorful bonnets. Jonas hesitated at the door until Rachel caught his eye, gesturing to the empty space beside her and the girls on the rough-hewn pew. As he settled next to them, the youngest sister giggled softly, earning a gentle shush from Rachel. The preacher's voice filled the small space, speaking of empty tombs and second chances, of winters yielding to spring. His words about redemption touched something deep in Jonas's heart. During a hymn, Rachel's hand brushed against his. The touch was slight, perhaps accidental, but Jonas did not pull away. Their fingers remained close, a quiet acknowledgement of something growing between them. After the service, the girls surrounded Jonas in the churchyard. "You clean up proper nice," the second youngest teased, tugging at his sleeve. "Almost like real family now." "He is family," Rachel corrected softly, her eyes meeting his. As evening painted the sky in soft purple, Jonas walked the familiar path to his cabin. Lamplight spilled from his windows, welcoming him home. From the ridge where they had once stood as silent watchers, the 5 girls waved cheerfully before turning toward their own farm. Jonas paused on his porch, watching their white caps disappear into the dusk. "Thank you, Lord," he whispered, feeling truly at peace for the first time in years. His cabin was no longer a hiding place, but a home. And he was no longer alone. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.